In this video, we explore what are smart objects and how we can exploit them. So, to begin with, there are actually two levels at which you can deal with smart objects. So, just to explain to you, here's a raw file which I'm going to open in the raw processor. So, once the image file is open in the raw processor, you do whatever your basic processing is that you may wish to do. Then go into the workflow, and in the workflow you have in the options, leaving everything to what you want, Adobe RGB. My recommendation is work with 16-bit, but for the sake of convenience over here, I'm just going to leave it to 8-bit. I'm not resizing anything, I'm not sharpening anything, but right at the bottom, I'm going to click Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects. Now, before I do this, I'm going to cancel this and bring your attention to this where it says Open Image. When you change it to Smart Object, notice currently it says Open Image. As I check this, it becomes Open Object, because a smart object is not really a rasterized image, but it's more a representation with all the information available to you to go back to the original file. So I hit OK, and when I click on Open Object, that image will open itself up within Photoshop. Working with Lightroom, image into Lightroom, and it's available to me in my library. And then I go into my develop module. So if you notice, if you go into your export, let's say I go into my export and I want to create a preset. Unfortunately, when you go through the variable options, image file format, there is no smart object available to you anywhere in here. So you can't really export the image, okay? So what you need to do is, once you have done whatever adjustments that you need to make to the image file, you go into Photo menu at the top, and then you come into Edit In. And when you come into Edit In, you have an option of editing in Photoshop, or you can open as Smart Object in Photoshop. So let's see what happens when I click on Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. And brings it up in Photoshop as a smart object. So I already had the file available. Not really, no. This is the new file. So it by default brings it in at 16-bit. Okay. So I opened it twice, so ignore that. That's why it took longer. And here we go. It says a smart object. Now, the problem, the one little thing that's a quirk, if I now wish to edit this, what will happen? It'll open up the Adobe Camera Raw processor associated with Photoshop. It won't take you back to Lightroom. That's the only limiting factor, so be aware of that. So, how to identify the smart object? If you look at the Layers panel, there is a tiny icon associated with this image. This signifies that this now is a smart object. So with a smart object, you can't really do any direct edits on the image at a pixel level. If I were to try and create a selection of any kind, so I'm just doing a random selection, rectangular, and I hit delete, Photoshop tells me that the object is not directly editable. So this is one limiting factor of a smart object. Now, the advantage of the smart object is that, let's say, for whatever reasons you realize that, this image could use a little more of this or that. So as opposed to creating an edit layer over here, you simply double click on the image and it reopens itself within the raw processor. And I can go in there and do whatever little edits that I want. So I'm gonna create a little more contrast in here and bring that highlight down a tiny bit. So that's about it. Or I could go into hue, saturation, and luminance and say, hey, I want to minimize the reds a little bit. And along with the reds, the yellows to influence the image, or do whatever that you need to, and you hit OK. And as you hit OK, it updates and says preparing smart object, and it'll then update this particular image. There we go. So it has updated itself. So this is one approach which allows you to address the image file from the raw stage as a smart object. Now, I'm going to close this, or, well, for the sake of convenience, I'm going to close this. Or what I could do is the following. I could duplicate the layer, and once I have duplicated the layer, I'm going to shut down the smart object layer, take this, go into the layer menu at the top, and come into Rasterize. Now, don't do smart objects globally, but in this case, since I've switched it off, it's not going to affect my other layer. But I would recommend that you simply click on layer. So it'll basically rasterize the selected layer. Now, once it has been rasterized, you now have the ability to delete or add or do what you need to. So if I deleted it, it'll get rid of that selection. Okay? So based on this, this is the different behavior. The other behavior is that, let's say I continue to do some edits on it. Okay? So I create a blank layer. I name it as sky. Oh, I forgot to name this one retouch. And I go back into the sky. I choose the gradient tool and choose a gradient, and I am going to take on a light blue to transparent. Make sure it's on the left, and I'm going to reduce the image size a little bit because I wish to apply it from a little higher up so that the transition is nice and smooth. And there we go. Oops, it's a radial gradient, so I need a linear gradient. So here I apply the linear gradient. Once I've applied the linear gradient, I will go and change the mode. And you have a choice. Different blend modes will behave differently. If I go into multiply, or if I go into screen, or if I go into overlay or soft light, or just color, they will all behave differently. So I actually like the screen layer. It makes the sky look a lot brighter. So I'm going to create that. Okay, so that's one layer. Now at the same time, I wish to darken a little bit at the bottom layer. So I create another, and I'm going to call it darken bottom. And then go back into my gradients, and I wish to pick on a black to transparent. And I mean to keep it normal. And again, it's an empty layer, and I'm going to apply it down here. Now, you notice that it's also creating a little muddiness in here, so we need to change the blend mode. Once again, depending on the blend mode, the behavior will evolve. So it depends on what you want and how much of a change you wish for. So I kind of like the soft light or the multiply, whichever one. So I'm going to stick with soft light. I can also then adjust the opacity levels to change accordingly. So if I kept it at 100%, it became too dark. So I'm lowering it to about, 60%. So once I lower it to about 60%, it starts to look quite nice actually. Now that I have done this, this is where smart objects really come into play. What I'm going to do is take the topmost layer, press Shift, and come to the last working rasterized layer, and I group it. Or if I wanted, I could add this unseen layer as well. This could be on or off, it doesn't really matter because there's another layer at the top. So now that I've selected all these layers, I'm going to go into the flyout menu and say convert to smart object. And let's see what happens. So you notice all the layers have disappeared and exclusively one layer is now visible, which then I can do what I wish to. Now, the benefit of a smart object is I haven't lost all the layers. If I double click on this icon, it will reopen the original image with all the layers. So let's say I decide that, hey, you know something? I'm going to make it into a black and white, and I want the black and white to be available to me as a smart object. So let's say I am clicking on the black and white adjustment layer, and that's my black and white adjustment. I can do whatever little tweaks that I want, and once I've done it, I look at my overall image and I say, hey, that looks pretty cool, and I save it. Once I save it, and I want you to pay attention, watch what happens to the original. It updates itself, and now I can go close it if I wish to. There we go. So now I have a black and white layer. If for whatever reasons I now realize that, whoa, I should not have done a black and white, I simply have to double click on it, and there we go. All the layers are available. I'm going to change this black and white layer into a luminosity layer so that I can further enhance my colors in there. So there's not a whole lot of greens. I want to work the yellows a little brighter. The reds look good. I can play with the blues and the cyans. So brighten it. This looks pretty realistic, but I want to darken a little bit in there. Yeah, that's acceptably okay. Once I'm done with it, I simply save it. And once it's saved, my original file, and I'm going to close this, my earlier smart object file has become available in an updated form. So that's one advantage. The other advantage is as follows. You can apply what are known as smart filters onto this particular layer. And to give you an idea, let's say I go into filter, and I can even use the camera raw processor as a filter. Okay, so I say, hey, let's use the camera raw filter and we can do something with it. So I now suddenly decide, hey, I wanted it as a black and white because I prefer the raw processor. Do what you need to do. Once I have done this, I hit OK. So what you will notice is that now the smart filter is available here. So as much as I have done a black and white, I really don't want it as a black and white. I want it to do my adjustments as a separate layer with a specific blend mode. So you see this little icon with two lines and sliders. If you double click on it, it'll open up the blend options for this particular filter. And you can choose whatever you wish it to do. So I could say, hey, let's put a soft light on it. So I click on soft light and the contrast kicks in. And I can then control the opacity of this particular layer. So you can do a lot of variables in the way you process your image based on what you're doing with it and what kind of blend mode you're applying to it. So I'm just being sort of nonsensical in some ways, but this is mostly to give you an idea of how you can manipulate and the benefits of a smart filter. So I like this and I hit OK. So I do have the ability to completely switch it off or switch it back on. Okay? Or I also have the ability to selectively just go into the actual filter by double clicking on it and say, hey, I didn't really want a monochrome, I just wanted color in there, and I go back into color and I can bring things to 0. Okay, so whatever you may wish to do is accessible to you. So this is now back to square one. I hit OK. And once I hit OK, it's going to update itself. You can also continue to do any adjustments above this layer if you so desire. For example, if I wanted to do a black and white conversion using just the black and white adjustment layer, so it comes above it. So I did my basic adjustment, and then here is my next stage of evolution in this particular file. So once again, sky's the limit, and this is the whole point of exploiting smart objects and smart filters. So I'm going to trash this black and white adjustment layer because I don't really need it. Now that I have done this, I want to place another image on top of it. Now the other image that I wish to place on top of it is a multi-layered image file. For example, so if I come in here, for the sake of argument, I pick on this image. Now notice this image is 909 megabytes, which implies that there's a whole lot of stuff going on in this particular image. So there are many layers, and we'll figure out what layers there are. I right click and I say place in Photoshop. And be patient, it's a large file, so it's preparing. By default, it looks at the Photoshop file and says, hey, I'm going to place you as a smart object, just in case you may wish to edit the image at any level or whatever that you may wish to do. And when the image comes here, you can distort it, mutilate it, enlarge it, reduce it. It will really not influence the actual original image because it is primarily available in here as a smart object. Okay, so there are really no pixels per se. So here's the image. I'm going to scale it down just so that it fits reasonably. So I place it in here, and then you click on the OK checkmark button, or double click in the frame, or simply hit the Enter key on the keyboard, or the return key, whatever it may be. So what you will notice over here is that this image will also have an icon indicating that this is a smart object. So there you go. So here is that icon. Now, if I suddenly, for some reason, decided that, hey, I wanted to remove the background and I just wanted the person or whatever it may be, so I can simply double click on this image, and what it will do is, since Photoshop by default had placed this image as a smart object in here, it will open up the original image with all its layers to allow you to do whatever edits you may need to do to make it work over here. So what you're really doing is, so you see there's a whole lot of layers in here. I mean, I really don't want to make any change in here per se, but if I wanted to, so let's say, I could do whatever I needed to and then hit save, and once I hit save, it will basically carry the image over with the updated version of the file. So I'm not making any changes. If I so wish to, I could do whatever the heck I wanted to, and it will update itself. Once it's done, you hit save. So you can do file save or control or command S to save the file. And as it saves itself, since I don't want to save, I'm not going to say make any changes, so I don't want to save it. I just wanted to show you what the behavior is. So this is how you can effectively use smart objects. I hope this makes some sense.